Intercultural communication scholars Larry Samovar, Richard Porter, Edwin McDaniel, and Carolyn Roy describe communication and culture as the voice and the echo. This, to me, seemed to be an excellent way to describe the relationship between communication and culture, a relationship that we're just now beginning to investigate. The dominant communication within any group of individuals is going to reflect the values, attitudes, beliefs, and the worldviews of the individuals who are in that group. As those people interact with one another, their communication continues to reinforce those ideas, and then cultural norms are born. Thus, as individuals voice thoughts and beliefs that are sanctioned by the group, that communication is echoed through the cultural norms and ideals that were created within the interactions. We now know a little bit more about how communication and culture are related, but how do we define the term communication? Well, communication is a symbolic and dynamic, receiver-oriented process whereby meaning is shared and negotiated. Let's look at the definition one word at a time. Communication is symbolic, which means that the words we speak have no real meaning in and of themselves. The words we use are simply agreed upon symbols that represent the things that we're talking about. Because communication is symbolic, things can get tricky when we don't share symbols. For example, were someone to ask me where the water fountain is, I would likely direct them to something that looks like this. For many people in Wisconsin, however, this is not called a water fountain. It's called a bubbler. In case you didn't know, bubbler was a brand name for Kohler's water fountain. So much like we call facial tissues Kleenex, whether they're Kleenex or not, the term bubbler stuck when referring to water fountains, but really only in the state of Wisconsin. Since I now live in Wisconsin, I might be misdirecting the individual who actually wanted to see this. This example shows that unless we agree to some extent on the meanings that are associated with the symbols we use, we can have problems when we're interacting with one another. Knowing that individuals within a culture can have vastly different symbol systems, and as such they can have a very difficult time finding shared meaning, we can accept that when individuals from different cultures come to interact with one another, it might be even harder to find shared meaning because the symbol systems they use have the potential to be vastly different from one another. The definition also lets us know that communication is a dynamic process, and this means that communication is always happening, and that the individuals who are in an interaction are simultaneously sending and receiving messages. So as your best friend is telling you about a really stressful life event, you aren't able to just relax and absorb that information. You as the listener need to actively listen to the message, communicate that you're listening with your nonverbals, and then communicate messages of support when it's your turn to talk. This example shows us that communication is dynamic because it isn't just about passively receiving messages exactly as they were intended. Right? Both the speaker and the listener are constantly communicating during any interaction. That being said, communication is also receiver-oriented. And it's receiver-oriented because ultimately it's the receiver, or the one who's interpreting the message, who gets to determine what the message means and what should be done with the message. So the receiver is the one who technically determines the outcome of the communicative interaction because they're the one who gets to interpret what that communication meant. So imagine you're having a fight with your significant other. You're fighting over the fact that your significant other keeps stating that a character on a reality TV show is really attractive. Your significant other apologizes to you for hurting your feelings and states that it's nothing but a harmless crush. While your partner was in fact sincere in what he or she was saying, you don't think that the apology was honest, so you don't forgive your partner, and the bad feelings continue between the two of you for a couple more days. In this interaction, you got to determine whether or not your partner's message was sincere because you were the one receiving the message. It's because of that that we state that communication is receiver-oriented. Communication is also a process, and as it's a process, there's many components that are important in the process. The first one of these components are the sender-receivers. Now, I call them sender-receivers rather than just the sender and the receiver to remind everyone that each person in an interaction has to simultaneously perform both roles. The sender-receivers are responsible for encoding and decoding. So encoding is when the message is created, and decoding is the processing or the interpreting of the message. So as I've already implied, within interaction, sender-receiver A encodes a message, and that message is sent to sender-receiver B through a channel. Now, a channel is anything that provides a connection between people. So examples of channels would be face-to-face, telephone, email, text message. All of those are ways that we could get a message from one person to the next person. All right, so the message has gone from sender-receiver A to sender-receiver B through a channel, and then sender-receiver B needs to decode that message and decide what to do with it. The only problem is that sometimes when a message is going from one person to the next, it gets interrupted by the noise that's happening around the message. So the message might change a little bit or become distorted as it moves from one person to the next. Noise, then, is any of the stimuli in the environment that compete for the attention of the sender-receivers. So if you're hungry and your stomach is growling, that's noise. If the birds are singing in the background and you think it's going to be a beautiful spring day, that's noise. If you don't share a symbol system with the individual you're interacting with, that's noise. So again, noise is going to be anything that gets in the way of that message being understood. Whether or not the message was affected by noise in a meaningful way, sender-receiver B is going to decode that message once it gets to him or her, and then they're going to send a message back to sender-receiver A. We call this message feedback, right? So they're going to decode that first message, and then they're going to encode a feedback message which will be sent to sender-receiver A, who is responsible for decoding that particular message. This process will continue and be happening simultaneously as individuals attempt to accomplish their communicative goals. One final consideration we have to think about when we look at any interaction, however, is the context in which that interaction happens, or the communication environment. So context is going to include the location of the interaction, the occasion that people are gathered for, the time of day, the time of year, the number of people who are in the interaction, any of the history between the people who are interacting is also going to be important to understanding that message and understanding what's occurring within the communication interaction. So, while this process likely seems very complex, really, this is a very oversimplified version or an oversimplified example of what happens when individuals are communicating. So whether we're communicating within our culture or we're communicating between cultures, we need to be aware of all of these elements in the communication process so that we can make strategic decisions about how we want to communicate so that hopefully we can have more effective communication. So for example, if I know that members of my grandparents' generation do not appreciate using text messaging, or I should even say of my parents' generation, because my father refuses to receive a text message. So if I know that those individuals don't appreciate that channel of communication, then I can use that information to decide how am I going to utilize channels when I'm trying to get a message across to someone. So we can use our knowledge of what the process looks like to better understand how we communicate with other people. The last part of the definition to consider is that communication is shared and negotiated. Right, communication is shared because the end result of a communication interaction should be shared meaning. So both individuals who are interacting should have a shared understanding of what's just occurred. All right, and this shared understanding is something that they negotiate through their interaction. So if the message seems very clear to both individuals, there's not a lot of negotiation. But if it seems unclear, sender-receiver B might question sender-receiver A so that they can come to a better understanding of what the meaning of that message is. So that would be how they negotiate what those messages and what those meanings are. Now this process can get complicated because lots of times words have multiple meanings. And so when things have multiple meanings, there might be more negotiation that has to happen, or people might leave an interaction having vastly different ideas of what's occurred. So again, when people have different cultural backgrounds and they share or they don't share symbol systems would be the better way to think of it. When they don't share those symbol systems, they might think that they're shared and walk away with vastly different interpretations of a communication interaction. So as we've learned, communication is in fact the process by which we create, share, and then change our culture. Again, this makes communication the voice and culture the echo of that voice. As always, let me know if you have any questions, And I hope you all have a great day.